Welcome everyone, good evening. Welcome to the program Lawfare, how right-wing populists are redefining rights in Europe and the US, a discussion on law, politics and the future of democracy. This program is part of the Governance for Society series, in which we'll explore action perspectives for complex societal and governance issues in collaboration with the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Each edition is made in collaboration with a specific researcher from this university, and this time it's Pola Cebulak, who is an assistant professor at the Vrije, but also the chairholder of the Jean Monnet Chair on Judges Against Illiberalism. Today's event will be recorded and can be watched back later on the Backhaus des Weicher YouTube channel. But before we will start, let me ask the audience, as our panelist member, are you familiar with the concept of doom scrolling? Who knows what is doom scrolling? Raise your hands. Okay, so for the record, doom scrolling is this act of continuously scrolling through negative news or distressing social media feeds without taking a break. This behavior can lead to increased feelings of anxiety, stress, helplessness due to prolonged exposure to pessimistic or upsetting content. And if you're like me, maybe you recently noticed a new type of distressing content emerging alongside news about climate change and armed conflicts around the world, namely news reporting about the legal development. So news or reporting on the new limitation and restriction on rights that were once considered firmly established. Moreover, this type of news coincides with the rise of populism governments. So maybe we should be talking about a new category of legal doom scrolling. And to address this issue and to ask whether our feeling of anxieties when we read about legal development is justified, and if why so, and maybe what can we do about it, we have gathered a group of excellent speakers for today now. So in the order that I will be asking questions, Sarah de Lange is a professor of political pluralism at the University of Amsterdam, specializing in political parties, party system, and democratic pluralism in Europe, but also populism. Scott Cummings, and welcome. Scott Cummings, who is a professor of law and legal ethics at the University of California, who is currently researching the role of lawyers in democratic backsliding. Pola Cebulak, the Jean Monnet chairholder and assistant professor of European law at Vrije Universiteit, specializing in European courts and legal mobilization in response to illiberal backlash. Karolina Kocemba, a socio-legal scholar, postdoc at the University of Wrocław in Poland and European University Institute in Italy, her research focuses on the reproductive rights and transnational legal mobilization. My name is Michał Stambulski. I'm assistant professor in legal theory at Erasmus University Rotterdam, and I will be serving as a moderator at today's events. Thank you. But we are also curious, who do we have in the audience? As you've heard, we have some academics, so please raise your hand if you're also an academic. Do we have any students also? I will not ask, were you forced by your professor to come here. Any lawyers or judges? Welcome. People from outside of Europe? Anybody from? Okay, welcome. People that doom scroll. Okay, unfortunately. So first I will give a very short introduction to set the scene for our discussion. Then we'll have 2 rounds of questions with our experts, and then I will open the floor for the comments and questions from the audience. So the introductory and question part should take around 40 minutes, which will leave us, I hope, around 40 minutes for the discussion with the audience. So if I could ask for the first slide now. In recent years, the rise of right-wing populism has dramatically reshaped the political and legal landscape in Europe and the US, sparking a widespread backlash against democratic norms and human rights. It seems that the contemporary populism and autocrats not only mastered the rules and nuances of the constitutional system, but also found allies in order to reshape this system. In other words, they do not act alone. Let me give you a few examples. On 24 of June 2022, the US Supreme Court issued the Dobbs v. Jackson decision, which overruled Precedent Roe v. Wade from 1973 and ruled that US Constitution does not confer a right to abortion. The decision sent shockwaves throughout the global public opinion. Margaret Atwood, author of the famous dystopian novel The Handmaid's Tale, commented, "Theocratic dictatorships do not lie only in the distant past. There are a number of them on planet today. What is to prevent the United States from becoming one of them?" We could add, what about Europe? 2 years later, so another example, in October 2020, the Polish Constitutional Court tightened one of the EU's strictest abortion regulations by ruling that abortion undertaken because of the fetal defects is unconstitutional. This reason accounted for the 98% of legal abortion in the country at that time. This decision sparked mass mobilization and protests more than 150 Polish cities, the largest demonstration since the country regained democracy in 1989. 2 years before that, in July 2018, the Bulgarian Constitutional Court declared that Istanbul Convention, the first comprehensive European instrument for protecting women and girls from all forms of violence, is unconstitutional because it contains the word gender in it. Those are only few high-profile examples concerning women's rights. However, the actions of courts that restrict rights in the liberal sense of the word are much broader. Sticking with the Polish and US example, in 2019, the Polish Constitutional Court ruled that fining businesses for refusing to serve LGBTQ customers is unconstitutional. In 2023, the United States Supreme Court limited the use of race-based affirmative action in the Students for Fair Admission v. Harvard case in the college admission, something that many commentators welcome as dismantling of the infrastructure designed to provide some kind of racial equality in the country. When looking at this type of cases, public attention often focuses on the populist politicians and the course they have taken or hijacked. However, in those cases, the issues were started and initiated not by politicians, but by non-governmental organizations. If you will look at the Conservative Political Action Conference, so-called CPACs, organized in the recent years in Hungary and the US, which those conferences became this kind of global recurring gathering for populism. So alongside politicians like Donald Trump, Javier Milei, Jair Bolsonaro, Geert Wilders, we see also many representatives of the non-governmental organization who discuss and present their ideas at these events, and this is only one of several forums for coordinating actions and exchanging experiences between those organizations. Right-wing organizations and their affiliated lawyers have been mobilizing the law for years, trying to saturate the legal system and public life with traditional and right-wing values. Global populism shift that we are witnessing now opens new windows of opportunity for these organizations. They file complaints and draft opinions, often using very sophisticated legal instruments and extensive legal expertise. This argumentation and expertise is later used to justify new populist policies and legislation. They also establish their own universities, law schools, where they promote candidates for judicial appointment. By doing that, they are providing populists with a reliable reservoir of personnel. While democratic commitment requires us to allow to operate this organization, everybody has the right to organize and try to influence the constitutional structure of the country. The close ties with populism politicians through ideological affiliation, but also through the use of public funds, as well the overall impact of such alliances on the rule of law might be a cause for some kind of concern. Perhaps the dictatorship that the Atwood mentions are no longer forged by revolutions or military coups, but rather by what sociologist and legal scholar Kim Lane-Schepele called autocratic legalism, targeted legal changes that slowly restricts individual freedom. It's a boiling frog scenario. At first glance, these measures appear to fall within the bounds of democratic society and typical debates over the content of basic constitutional rules. But their autocratic nature only becomes apparent if we step back and recognize that these changes are aimed at centralizing power and eliminating any possibility of resistance and democratic change of those in power. And a lot of question marks in order to help entangle this role of law in populism. We have a group of excellent scholars today with us. So starting with Sarah. Sarah, for years, Western European liberal democracies have been vocal critics of democratic backsliding in Central and European and Eastern European part of the continent. But now we see a certain shift. Populist parties seems to a little bit lose the momentum in Central and Eastern Europe and gain the momentum in Western part of the continent. In general, the rhetoric and agenda of right-wing populism seems to resonate across the Europe. So, Sarah, do you have, because you looked closely in your work at the impact of populism on liberal democracy, so can you explain this contemporary appeal of populism? And maybe we are overreacting. Maybe populism is not a threat to democracy, but some kind of correction of it.
Those are many questions in one. So let me start by saying that, so you talk about right-wing populism in this context. Personally, I prefer to talk about the far right in this context, because the parties that we're actually talking about, and that ranges from Bolsonaro in Brazil to Modi in India and everything in between, are parties that are first and foremost nativist in their political orientation. So they adhere to a very xenophobic form of nationalism. And on top of that, they're also populist. But the way that they look at society from a populist lens, because the traditional populist perspective is, making a division between good ordinary citizens and a corrupt political and social elites, because it is informed by nativism, it is about, the true French, the true Dutch, the true Hungarian people, and a cosmopolitan elite. So I think, really grasping that it's a combination of these two ideological elements is very important. Also for understanding the relationship with liberal democracy. Because the nativism itself already entails tensions in the sense that it denies pluralism and it is at odds with freedom of religion, minority rights, anti-discrimination principles, etc. And on top of that, the populism also denies pluralism because it assumes that, the people are undivided and have a unified will. And it opposes checks and balances in the political system because, the people are sovereign. So ultimate power should reside with parliament and government and not with an independent judiciary or with media, etc. So that being said, we've seen the rise of the far right across the globe. And what determines the impact of the far right on liberal democracy is its electoral strength, so whether these parties have majority status or not. And that is what for a long time differentiated Western Europe from Central and Eastern Europe. Whether they come to power in a presidential or a parliamentary system, so that's what differentiates Europe on the one hand from, Brazil and the US, for example, on the other hand, and how strongly rooted the democratic system is in terms of, how recent democratization has been and therefore how vulnerable institutions are. And that is also what makes a big difference, of course, between Latin American countries, Central and Eastern European countries, and Western Europe. That is not to say that liberal democracy cannot erode in Western Europe. And I think we have a very interesting case that we don't discuss enough, which is Italy. There has been erosion of democracy already under the various Berlusconi governments in terms of independence of the judiciary, independence of the media. But we're clearly seeing the same now under Meloni. She has promised recently to reform the judiciary and to break up prosecution from judges and to put prosecution entirely under the control of the Ministry of Justice. And we've also seen that the Meloni government has tried to take over control over especially the public broadcaster. So it can happen in Western Europe as well. But again, the situation there is that there's not one far-right party that has majority status, but there's multiple far-right parties that together have majority status, so that also have more leeway to enact their agenda than, for example, the coalition government here in the Netherlands or the coalition government that's currently in power in Finland, which is also comprised of a far-right party. So it's, the picture is quite nuanced, I think, in that respect.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's now have a look on the other side of the Atlantic, where a lot of European populists put their hopes. So Scott, all eyes are on US now, where Donald Trump won a second term and appears to be dismantling the US constitutional system. Since you analyzed his first term, particularly the role of lawyers in attempting to overturn the 2020 election that Trump lost, and then recently you've also been looking comparatively at the role of lawyers in populist regimes. So who are those lawyers in backsliding democracies, and what's their basic logic of action?
So I spent my career studying the role of lawyers in democracy. I've always been quite proud of being a scholar in America, studying how social movements have been able to use law and leverage the rule of law to expand and deepen democracy in important directions. And so despite all of its flaws, American democracy has nonetheless served as an inspiration and an incubator of democratic innovation. It is therefore incredibly distressing to be in the position of watching my country become the innovator of a far more dangerous type of democratic innovation, which is democratic backsliding. And we see this every day now coming out of the Trump administration, which has learned the lessons not just of Russia, Hungary, and other democratic backsliding nations in Europe, but also learned from its own failures in the first Trump administration to effectively target and at this point dismantle many of the core democratic institutions that check executive power. So all eyes indeed on the United States. And so I think to respond to the question, who are these lawyers? So this is a legal movement, and the lawyers that are at the forefront of this legal movement come out of a radicalized part of the conservative legal movement in the United States. The conservative legal movement in the United States started in the 1980s as a deliberate response to left progressive legal mobilization, which won important cases in the 1950s and the 1960s by appealing to the Supreme Court to advance the rights of minority groups, most notably to end racial segregation in the famous case of Brown versus Board of Education. Conservative legal movement said, we're going to do the same thing in reverse, started to build a network of organizations in the 1980s, became very successful as the United States Supreme Court shifted to the right, and for the most part, through the beginning of the 2000s, played within the traditional rules of the game, right? They were operating according to traditional notions of legal and political contact. They were within the zone of traditional constitutional conflict. That changed during the first Trump administration in dramatic ways. So I've studied these lawyers. I've studied their legal approaches. Who are these lawyers? It's interesting that most of these lawyers at the forefront of the radical far-right elements of this conservative legal movement that's now in charge of the country are not legal elites, right? They're not coming from the most elite sectors of the American legal educational system. They're not coming from the most elite sectors of the law firms and the bar. They're mostly lawyers who have been educated at lower top-tier law schools and have been radicalized in support of the Trump autocratic agenda. I'll give you one example. The new Attorney General, Pam Bondi, is from Florida. She went to the Stetson Law School, which probably most of you never heard of. It's a very low-ranked school. She's not a legal elite. This is by design, right? This is by design. The mainstream conservative elites have too much stake in the system, and they've been not entirely pushed out because the Vice President of the United States is a legal elite. He went to Yale Law School, but they've been sidelined in important ways. So who are they? They're mostly non-elite. Why have they signed on to this agenda? There are different trajectories, I think, of lawyers who have endorsed this new form of autocracy in the United States. Some of them have endorsed Trump from the first term because they believe that he can deliver the ideological objects that they want to see realized. And so many of the first Trump administration lawyers came out of the movement to limit abortion access and increase the role of religion in society. These lawyers were actually litigating against the election on the grounds that it was stolen. They had no election experience. They were lawyers who cared about the ideology and wanted to collaborate with Trump to deliver that outcome. You see some lawyers who just want power. So there's famously Rudy Giuliani kind of signed on to the first Trump administration. These people want to be close to power. J.D. Vance, who is the vice president, was anti-Trump until he realized that he wasn't going to gain power, and now he's the most vociferous Trump supporter. And I think then as the autocracy has accelerated in terms of the process, you see lawyers now who are not committed to the project, but who are just scared or indifferent, who then lend support to the project. And we've seen this in the last few weeks with respect to law firms that have failed to stand up to the administration and have kind of now gone into line in ways that we can talk more about. Finally, just briefly in terms of kind of strategy, how do they do this? What's their legal logic? There's this idea out there that I'm sure many of you have heard about called the autocratic legal playbook. And the basic notion is that these autocrats enlist lawyers to figure out what the loopholes are in constitutional democracy so they can knock down all of the independent centers of institutional power. That is what's going on right now in the United States with these executive orders. If you look at them, they seem to be about policy, right? Ending DEI, deporting immigrants, and they are about those things. But if you look at them more carefully, they use these policy justifications to justify knocking down the institutional centers of democratic resistance. They're knocking down law firms in the legal profession. They're knocking down universities, and they're coming after government lawyers. They've already captured the government and legal sector. And there are more institutions, the courts, to come. And so this is a very well-developed strategy. It's been now innovated by the United States, and it's in the danger zone.
Thank you very much. Poland has become, maybe next to Hungary, one of Europe's usual suspects when we talk about the human rights backsliding. Carolina, you look at the country and its constitutional trajectory from the point of view of women's rights. So if we now do a deep dive and look at the country, so what kind of legal actions have the right wing used in Poland, and which fundamental values and rights are being targeted and why?
So you've mentioned already human rights backsliding, so I cannot say there was no human rights backsliding. As you mentioned, abortion case, it was vastly limited. It's almost impossible to legally perform an abortion. But I can say that populist government and Law and Justice Party was very careful, and they didn't limit human rights through legislation. Rhetorics is something totally different, and they were very active in this sphere of rhetorics. They targeted values such as LGBTQ+ rights, gender equality. The word gender is here crucial, right? You've mentioned also Istanbul Convention that was ratified by many countries, but later it was these countries withdraw from the convention because of the word gender exactly. So it was part of anti-gender movements. These movements appeared in Europe and across the globe 15 years ago. And it was also the time when Law and Justice Party started their electoral campaign. And it was a perfect moment, perfect match. they used these values in their electoral campaign, and it proved effective. It was perfect tool to conduct electoral campaign. So it was not only governing party that conducted this campaign, Law and Justice Party. They had allies with right-wing organizations who supported them, who also conducted these rhetorics, as well as Catholic Church. So it was purely rhetorics, but Catholic Church supported Law and Justice Party before elections. They conducted these campaigns. They mobilized voters in the churches. And at the end, they demanded some paying the debt. They wanted something for that support, and it was an abortion. But how it happened, I said already that not through the legislation. There were already 8 attempts to limit abortion laws through legislation from 2011, and the main point was to limit abortion. These projects were pretty different, but the base was to limit abortion because of fetus defects. Usually, parliaments from 2011, they ignored these initiatives, but in 2016, it was pretty close. And the society started to protest from 2016. Women started to do a break in their work. They started to go to the streets and massively protest. So it was a signal to Law and Justice Party. Oh no, we will lose our support if we will do it through legislation. They found another way. Another way was to pack the court, constitutional court, in 2018, I think. They packed the court with their own judges, and some of the judges were also their politicians. So they were in their own party earlier, before being in constitutional court. So these were politicians in court, and you know how it could rule. So what happened after the protests? 118 MPs, parliamentarists, decided to set a motion in constitutional court. They wanted to constitutional court to check if abortion laws are constitutional. And you can, Michał already said what is the effect of this motion, how it happened that abortion was limited. So you ask about legal tools. What are the tools? These tools were already there. So it's legislative initiative. So it's not something new. This is constitutional review. These were also strategic litigations conducted by right-wing organizations. They use also human rights language. They use opinions of a friend of a court. It's named amici curiae. I don't know if you who are not lawyers know the terms, or amicus brief. It's an opinion written by NGO and sent to the court to show argumentation. In this letter, they used language of human rights. They use EU law. They use international law. They frame abortion laws as violation of human rights. It was the mechanism that they said, if fetus is with defects, it's disabled person. If it's disabled person, it's a discrimination of disabled persons. So they actually reframe human rights this way. And I think why they proved to be effective, because they cooperate with each other. So right-wing NGOs, Catholic Church, and governing party. So it's more complex. It's not that simple that it's only governing party that limited human rights. You have more actors, as you already said. Thank you.
Thank you. Paula, Karolina mentioned litigation. And years ago, when I was a law student, strategic litigation itself was seen as a vehicle for some kind of progressive values and some kind of hurrah word that through litigation, minority groups can get access to some kind of protection. So since your research exactly digs into the problem of strategic litigation and you work on the topic, could you explain to us what is it, and is there a difference between the liberal and, let's say, populist use of litigation?
Yes, so I think it's definitely not this hooray that strategic litigations should be definitely supported at any in any situation. We are way beyond that, or we need to have a way more nuanced view, because I think that's the problem with many of these institutional avenues and opening up to kind of to more civil society, for instance, engagement in decision-making, that whenever you open these channels, they can be like used by anyone, and especially many of these extreme right-wing reactionary movements have really specialized a lot kind of in using them as well. So I think we see this definitely with strategic litigation, that it can be done for public interest, for private interest. It can be done with a more progressive agenda. It can be done with a more reactionary agenda. And I think, like, I don't know, because you ask what's the difference between, how do we distinguish it? Because, like, I think that's still a tricky one. I think, like, we cannot distinguish it based on the toolbox. Like, I think the kind of the procedures used and the tools used are often actually kind of the same. And that's where I think, like what Carolina just mentioned as well. But I think there is a difference in ideology, I would say, for now. Like, I'll try to, like, explain it better in terms of how they frame it. Because I think often, I don't know what we mean by strategic litigation as opposed to kind of any cases when someone goes to court to, I don't know, defend their rights, is mainly that strategic litigation involves a kind of a broader strategy that goes beyond the courtroom. So that often means that certain actors, whether it's companies, whether it's individual people, whether it's NGOs, but they go to court basically to pursue other goals. So they have a sort of a multi-step strategy, out of which going to the court is only part of it. And often they don't even exactly care whether they win or they lose, but they want to, I don't know, further. We often in our research talked about it, that they want to achieve effects either in the courtroom, so they want a broader change of the law, they want maybe a certain legislation annulled when they go to the courtroom. They sometimes want to achieve certain effects in the palace or in the kind of government. So they maybe want, I don't know, certain laws to be put forward or certain agenda to be changed at the political level. So they want to be heard there, or they want even effects in the square, in the public debate. So it also contributes to kind of to certain change in the public space. And often in terms of the toolbox, it often means that such strategic litigation is often embedded in some broader advocacy campaigns. But that's done by more progressive strategic litigation, more reactionary strategic litigation. We see that too. So it's obviously we have many NGOs, I don't know, litigating for climate change, like here with the Urgenda judgments and others. But we also have plenty of farmers' organizations. Like, I don't know, I study mostly like this also at the EU level. There you have like some very suspicious, like Kopa Korzeka is called. It's an organization of farmers in Brussels representing kind of the interest of farmers and also doing a lot of lobbying and litigation that, I don't know, some journalists were doing some investigations. They claim to have 1,000 members. Now they say like, oh, we missed a zero. We actually have 100 members. But they seem to have sufficient funding to be around, kind of, regardless of their membership. So this embedding in broader kind of advocacy campaigns we see from both. I don't know, also the fact that they kind of rely on certain legal rules. They invoke often, whether it's human rights or kind of general norms of EU international law, often even if it is kind of maybe a restrictive interpretation of rights or a very one focused very much on certain freedom ideas, on very kind of basic civil and political rights. But still kind of, we see this a lot. I don't know, Hungarian government would go to court at the EU level, arguing, trying to legally challenge to have judicial review of distribution of asylum seekers in the European Union, the directive on this, or the directive on conditionality of the funding based on the rule of law. So they would introduce those legal challenges that from a lawyer's point of view had very little prospect of success. Like most EU lawyers would say that that was hopeless. But arguing it in front of the court also like played to their national media, like played to kind of standing up to the EU, kind of playing the game. We saw it with regard to Poland, then in this case regarding cutting of trees in this national park in Poland at the border with Belarus. It was even the Minister of Environment that pleaded for Poland, not any lawyer. So clearly they were not addressing the judges, they were rather addressing, I don't know, the newspapers back home. So you see this, but I think in terms of there's still a difference. If we were try to see a difference in terms of the ideology between the more progressive and reactionary or populist and liberal strategic litigation, I would see that often, I don't know, the idea in liberal democracies in a way that we have like majoritarian decision making, that like people vote in elections and then the elected representatives vote by majority in parliaments, and that automatically leaves some people outvoted. And these people who are kind of outvoted, who are a sort of minority, not in the classic sense, but who like lost the majoritarian process, they can go to court. And that's where we have a certain checks and balances system, that the court would still check whether the democratic guardrails are intact, whether kind of the fundamental rights are not violated. But I think like how the populists are using this strategic litigation is not in that logic of the checks and balances. It's really more still in a very kind of majoritarian logic, that they're actually also framing the strategic litigation, and that it's either kind of, it's focused, and it's also a lot focused on like freedoms, yeah, because that's also this kind of, with a very particular understanding of freedom, like that's also been researched by many people, including like historian Anne van Down here, who has an excellent book on the history of the concept of freedom with Harvard University Press. And this kind of ideas of, we see it in this litigation of farmers, in the litigation against the COVID measures, like this arguments of like very kind of unfettered freedom ideas. And often, I don't know, also this very kind of majoritarian logic about like, I don't know, litigating in the name of some imaginary people and some kind of more like nearly majority thinking that, and trying to appeal to the judges that they need to resonate with the populace, kind of. And that's not a sort of a mathematical majority, definitely not. It's very much a kind of a discursively constructed majority and the people that the populists always appeal to. And I think we also see sometimes judges falling for that reasoning and trying to also kind of reason in a more majoritarian manner, or in a manner that sort of speaks more to kind of, to like some alleged kind of broader feelings in the society, kind of, because, and I think this is, I don't know, like, this is what I would call an ideological difference of the populist litigation, but I'm not sure whether that's the best framing. So if you have other ideas how to frame it, I'm very open.
All right, let's do one more quick round of questions before we'll open the floor. So Scott, we now see how changes in the US politics and US law influence Europe. For example, the cessation of US aid funding sent very big consequences and this kind of shockwaves even through the European NGOs. So from this broader perspective, how does this US far right influences the European legal order? Is those lawyers that you look at, do they have like more global ambitions, or they are more restrained to only the shaping the US legal landscape?
I'm going to do what I always get upset when my students do, which is not answer the question directly, but come back to it indirectly. And I think I want to just start by saying a couple things that pick up on Paula's points first before I address this question of what the ambitions of the far-right legal movement are. So I think one of the brilliant innovations of conservative legalism generally, and kind of the far-right legal movement in particular, is the co-optation of concepts and inverting their meaning in ways that confuse the public. And so we can trace back the idea of public interest litigation in the United States as the vehicle for delivering left progressive legal reform through courts in the 1950s and 1960s. And then all of a sudden we had the conservative legal movement creating conservative public interest law organizations to confuse the meaning. I think we can see the same thing happening with strategic litigation emerging as a concept that is designed to broaden democracy in progressive directions, then being utilized utilized by the right. I think we can now see it in terms of the way that the far-right movement has weaponized the concept of lawfare, which was developed as a term to critique the illegitimate use of legal process to dismantle and attack democratic institutions and the rule of law, and now it's being put on its head. And any time that a liberal group brings a lawsuit, now it's considered to be lawfare. So I think
we are using it still in the classic context.
Yeah. But the sort of the contest for the meaning of these terms, I think, is at the core of the autocratic legal strategy. So what's happening in Europe? I think it's clear that the far-right legal movement has ambitions beyond the United States, and I think the important point is that there are transnational legal networks. The autocratic legal playbook is something that has been developed through iterative engagement between Europe and the United States over the course of the last 25 years. The United States has borrowed a huge amount from Europe in developing its current strategy for autocratic takeover. If you read and may have heard of and read this Project 2025, which was the report of the roadmap for the far-right legal takeover that during the election campaign Trump claimed to have never heard of, but is now implementing essentially to a T. If you look at the executive orders, they draw specifically from Project 2025, which was designed after very deep and careful research of autocratization in places like Russia and particularly Hungary, where a fair number of the lawyers who are kind of leading the administration now went to study what happened after 2010. So I think it's a dynamic exchange. Clearly the United States has learned a lot, and now the United States is innovating in ways that I think are designed clearly to come back to Europe. I think the strategy is to use this autocratic playbook to come after individual countries in Europe and ultimately to come after the European Union, which is the institution that ultimately kind of holds democracy in check in ways that we do not have in the United States. So I think the ambitions are large and global, and I think that means that now is the time for Europe to think about how to reverse engineer the autocratic legal playbook and to close legal loopholes in European legal systems that will allow for the infiltration of autocratic ideas. We in the United States did not do this. I think now it is probably too late, but there is still time here to figure out, based on the mistakes that have been made in the United States, how to close the gaps and prevent the infiltration of these autocratic legal ideologies in ways that can, as we've seen in 2 months plus, can fundamentally reshape the oldest, longest-standing democracy in the world and put it on a track to dictatorship, which I do not think is hyperbolic to say at this time.
Thank you. Sarah, let's talk about the Netherlands. Minister Reinette Kluiver for Foreign Trade and Development Aid announced recently that the government would adopt Netherlands' first approach. This apparently means significant cuts into the aid projects focused on gender equality, education and climate, among others. We are still talking about some kind of foreign aid programs, but are similar significant cuts possible within the country? Or in other words, do you see any signs of lawfare happening here?
Yeah, so I'm going to abuse my position as well and tag on to what has just been said about strategic litigation, because I think this is a very important point, and there's something that I want to add to that, and that is draw attention to a very particular form of strategic litigation that the far right engages with, and that's the use of slaps. Which means that the far right regularly litigates against political opponents on the basis of defamation legislation, hate speech legislation, other tools, with the sole purpose of intimidating opponents. So these are cases that they are very aware well that they cannot win on the basis of merit, but in terms of, costs, energy, time, public attention, and sort of the online intimidation that attention to the case also generates, they hope to silence political opponents, whether that is journalists, scholars, or others, from criticizing the far right and criticizing their democratic backsliding measures. So that is also something to take into consideration also when you're thinking about, how to make the system more robust for what's coming. Now, with respect to the Netherlands, I think we're very complacent at the moment for two reasons. One is, I think there's a general belief in the Netherlands that the legal system is very strong, which if you look at, the way that judges are appointed in the Netherlands and how secure their positions are, etc., it's actually not the case. And there's good proposals on the table by legal scholars such as Jonathan Suharno and John Marijn to solidify the system and make it more protected from executive control. And the second is that everybody seems to forget that things are not going as fast as possible for the very singular reason that the current government coalition doesn't have a majority in the upper house. But that can change at any moment in time on the basis of the election results. And then, that we will have a completely new situation in terms of how much damage the government coalition can do to the liberal democratic system. So I'm not going into foreign aid particularly because I think these more general points about the resilience of the system are more important than specific policies that are being enacted at the moment.
Okay, so my two last questions go into the reversing lawfare and some kind of self-defense terrain. So Karolina, from 2023, Poland has a new government. The populist Lawyers' Justice was outvoted, and a liberal and center-conservative coalition emerged. How did this influence the previous populism lawfare, and how does the legal life after populism look like?
Well, there were high hopes, for sure, and I will outline the context and the background. There was mass mobilization to mobilize voters, and the turnout was the highest in the history. It was around 75%, and most of the voters, they were women. Before elections in these campaigns, NGOs conducted campaigns in the social media. They compared programs of the parties. They checked what are approaches to women's rights, to animal rights, to environmental rights, LGBTQ plus rights, and also they encouraged people to vote. So in October 2023, the Democratic Coalition won elections. Later they formed the coalition, and it appears they have 5 parties. And these are very diverse parties, from agrarian, conservative party, through liberal party, to leftist party. And now, 1.5 after elections, there is no consent regarding abortion. That was very important for voters. As you can see the data, that women, first time in the history, more women than men voted in elections. In late polls, voters responded that the most important issue for them was, first, economy, of course, and second, women's rights, including abortion. So society had high hopes, and nothing actually is still changed. So it's the main obstacle that there is no consent, there are too many parties, and it's not that easy to change a law. But another major obstacle is that legal and institutional legacy of the previous government would cost over 8 years. Peace, Law and Justice Party systematically reshaped the judiciary, packing court with loyal judges, and created parallel legal structures that continue to operate. That means that even if government would like to conduct changes and sustain rule of law, it's pretty problematic. They cannot, for example, change thousands of the judges. At the same time, they cannot say if all these judges are they were appointed during Law and Justice government, but are they political? I'm not really sure. So it's hard in one day to change 1,000 of judges and to be at the same time according to rule of law. So it's a paradoxical situation right now because voters wanted to change the system. They wanted to change rights, to reverse the ruling, but it's really hard to change legal system. So once populists are in power, it's really hard to reverse it. So you can see what will happen in the US later. I mean, maybe it will be better than in Poland.
Thank you. Paula, we are talking mostly about the national level, but lawyers put high hopes in the European judiciary. So my question is the European Union, and especially European judiciary, ready for right-wing lawfare?
So, I mean, this is always like a multi-level situation where also going to the European courts involves also going to the national ones, or often through the national ones. Definitely the European, like having more judicial avenues and more also venues for civil society to mobilize around kind of certain campaigns and also certain legal cases helps, especially in cases like, I don't know, Hungary or something where the national judiciary is completely out, or where there is no possibility to do it at national level. But I think also, I don't know, generally in terms of, I think the key in terms of resisting is really kind of not necessarily with the European judges. I think like that the role of the courts is very limited, and I think like we are rightly here focusing often on the civil society as actors and on this mobilization through civil society often of the people themselves, because I think like that's something that, I don't know, we need to mobilize like fast in a way. Timing is important, and we need to mobilize radically in a way, or I don't know, unequivocally. I don't know, like a lot of civil disobedience is also kind of necessary in those moments. And I think that's also, there's a colleague at the University of Copenhagen, Regice Rolfing, that has compared civil society in Hungary and in Poland and how they reacted to the democratic backsliding. And her conclusions are also in a way that the Polish civil society broke the law a lot more often than the Hungarians did, kind of. That many of the Hungarian organizations were still trying to kind of play within the legal rules, and that was not necessarily kind of the most effective way. And I think like in terms of the timing, there is this issue of obviously reacting also to the first signs, and I think that's also what Sarah was saying, that kind of some people here are thinking, oh, that's not, the reforms are all not yet confirmed or not really in action, so let us wait and see whether the cuts or whether the changes actually come. I think it might be kind of too late, a bit like kind of when they actually come. And I think, Scott, you have also written even about this fast and slow track of democratic demise. And the fast track for you, it's actually when they implement emergency laws and the executive takes a lot more power. And that's something that in the Netherlands we've seen this very concrete attempt of already kind of having the emergency laws, especially in the context of migration, and saying that there is a migration emergency currently in the Netherlands. I don't know, because people are afraid, kind of, I guess, or kind of that would be the reasoning that they would give, because not any actual numbers. And the fact that, like, I don't know whether we're already out of the danger zone and we're now through the more kind of slow track of democratic backsliding in the Netherlands, or whether this fast option is still on the table. And I think also in terms of the kind of the hardcore on the unequivocal resistance, I think, I don't know, maybe it's, okay, I'm just like brainstorming here because we are also thinking, but like I think in the US there has been also these studies about also the civil rights movements and how in a way the violence and the suffering of the activists has kind of solidified this cause also politically, and the kind of the achievements of this movement. And I do think that also in Poland, like the images that we are seeing kind of in the background as moments of the violence against peaceful protests of women where their arms were broken by the police, I think this also was a breaking moment for the peace government in terms of also their political popularity. So I'm not trying to kind of incite violence here necessarily, but I do think that there is a lot of importance also to the student protests right now in the Netherlands, and this mobilization also especially of younger voters that seem to be crucial in terms of making a difference, potentially even especially young women, but the participation of younger people in the election and their politicization. So I think like that those are important moments of kind of resistance to many of those kind of more populist majoritarian reforms kind of. So
thank you very much, and it's a good moment maybe to open the floor for some comments and questions. I will be collecting them. Maybe let's collect 3 or 4, and we'll get back to our panel. Please raise your hand.
There was talk about closing loopholes. I'm curious, like, if any of you can mention, like, what is an important loophole that can be closed, preferably in the Netherlands, then Europe, maybe the US, whoever wants to address that challenge.
Thank you.
You might hear a lot of confusion in my question, and that's because when I hear the discussion, I'm always struggling to understand if we're debating values or really democracy. And it's very clear, and the values I share, by the way, abortion rights I believe strongly in, but is that really inherently a democratic issue? And when we're trying to close loopholes, is that preserving democracy or actually going against democracy? When we're acting in civil disobedience, again, are we preserving democracy or fighting against the civil system? So I feel like we're choosing which ways we like democracy in, and maybe the solutions are in figuring out how we can get human rights and democracy to work together, where maybe we can have more direct democracy, for example, on the issue of abortion rights. And how can we not mix up the two? Because if we're closing the loopholes to the point where essentially the people cannot vote a way to change the system, then where is the democracy? And like I said, I share the values, but I'm confused.
Yep, thank you for this very interesting panel. I have two questions or reflections. I would really like to hear your thoughts on this. The first one is, why is it apparently so easy to change the system in such a short time and then so hard to change it back? And the second one, and that's a bit also picking up on this last question, is if like closing the loopholes, and I would very much agree on that, like acting early while it is still possible to close those loopholes and be careful what could be used later by far-right parties in power. But also like the more broader debates on what we mean with freedom. So like, you know, like not only legislation and closing the loopholes, but also having a shared idea of those terms and concepts that far-right parties and actors are trying to redefine and to change.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff Handmaker. So, yeah, it's wonderful panel, really very interesting discussion. And I just want to maybe throw something else into the works here, which is there's a lot of discussion about populism as that kind of being the great enemy here. And it relates a little bit to this gentleman's question here. Is really, are we not basically failing to grapple with this crisis in liberal democracy, both in, which is, I think, the very reason why these populist groups are existing, using the very same tactics of civil disobedience, storming the Capitol, the kind of protests, mass protests that have been taking place, and obviously strategic litigation as well. And do we need to actually really critically grapple with these liberal values which are underpinning democracy, which have actually reified a lot of these kind of inequalities that have existed in society. So in other words, don't we need to take a far deeper critical examination, also here in the Netherlands, of the system which is, you know, felt by so many people to be totally unrepresentative and is giving space to all these populist groups. Thank you.
I know that we have more questions, but let's now get back to the panel and I will collect them in the next round. So a lot of interesting questions. Who would like to start?
Shall I go first? I'll start maybe with your question, because that's, of course, a very fundamental one. And as a political scientist, and that might be a slightly different perspective, maybe from a legal scholar, I'm not sure. For me, you know, only having electoral democracy without any type of freedoms and rights makes elections themselves meaningless, because it puts constraints on the freedom of association, so founding new political movements. It puts constraints on, you know, freedom of information and therefore casting an informed vote. But also in terms of human rights, if we think about a proposal such as from Geert Wilders' PVV that citizens with dual nationality should not have voting rights, which, in the Netherlands would include over 1 million voters. If we take these rights away from them, then they don't have any recourse anymore to democratic means to get their rights back. So for me, it's very difficult to completely separate them, because there's always impact of what's happening in the liberal pillar on what the electoral pillar actually means, and whether, and then we haven't even discussed that part of, democratic erosion is also compromising electoral integrity, right, in many, many different ways that we see across the countries that we're studying. So that's one aspect. So it also goes a little bit to your question, I think. That doesn't mean that liberal democracy, and especially representation, is working well at the moment, right? I mean, if we look at the deeper causes of why these parties are successful, there is the failure of representation, both descriptive and substantive. So we have, highly educated parliaments that don't reflect the diversity of lived experience of citizens. Prior to the success of far-right parties, they were also not very representative substantively in terms of concerns of citizens about immigration, identity, and other issues. So in that respect, it's important that they're there. But of course, what you would like is that their presence itself then reinvigorates established parties to rethink their positions and ideology and their take on contemporary social issues. And that is what's really lacking. And there's all kinds of problems behind that in terms of, contemporary political parties no longer being properly rooted in society, etc. So it's a big problem to solve that cannot be done only with institutional engineering. And it links some in an indirect way also to your question, because if we're thinking about the Netherlands and the loopholes that need closing, one of the big loopholes in the Netherlands is that there is no legislation on political parties. I mean, there's a legislative proposal, but it has stalled because the current government coalition has no interest whatsoever in passing it. And that piece of legislation actually formalizes the possibility of party bans with proper procedures to not enact them too quickly or too easily. And currently, we're just using criminal legislation for that purpose, and that should never happen in a democracy, right? It's an improper use of legislation. So we're missing at least a big piece of legislation there just in terms of how our political system is regulated, namely that we don't have anything that says anything about, what is a party, when can it participate in elections, when we can disband it, or anything like that. And that is something that countries like Germany and other places have, and it's sort of a very important closing element of the system, also in terms of when political violence does occur. And we know that political parties, think of Golden Dawn in Greece, can actively, as organizations themselves, engage in political violence very extensively.
Can I just jump in on this? So, I mean, the classic definition of this autocratic legalism idea is when leaders use claimed electoral mandates to pit democracy against liberalism, which is to say that these ideas of fundamental rights protection are counter-majoritarian at their very core, and so you need institutions within a liberal democracy to be able to define and protect those counter-majoritarian minority rights. That's one part of the liberalism that I think you just mentioned. The other part of the liberalism, as I think about it, is also these independent institutions of democratic power that constrain the executive and prevent executive aggrandizement, which is precisely all of the pillars that are being knocked over now in the executive orders in the United States. It's what happened in these other countries that we've been discussing. So I think to, sort of, you're right to be concerned about the meaning of democracy, but if we think about democracy as incorporating these checks on executive power, we should all be worried, irrespective of our normative political values, when we see the courts being captured, right, and people being detained and deported without even being able to access lawyers, and we don't even really know where they actually are, and are not able to assert their rights because they've been embargoed in these particular ways, right? That's obviously no longer. The majority of American people may have voted for that. Let's just be perfectly clear. But that's not a liberal democracy anymore, and none of us should want to live in that society, obviously, because any one of us, if we dissent, could be on the other end. I think this then goes to this question, for me at least, of liberal democracy has failed in many ways, and so how do we think about supporting it? And my own view is that as a progressive, we have to think about it's a both-and strategy, right? We have to simultaneously think about how to defend and strengthen these rule of law institutions that have not always been good for representative democracy. Like, again, just to be clear. But we have to think about how to defend and strengthen them at the same time that we engage in these projects of political reform. And we have to think about how to work within the system and these institutional projects that do lend credibility and strength to these institutions as we simultaneously, in some cases, engage in civil disobedience, because that's what it requires to actually make democracy live up to its ideals. Let me just say lastly, on this question of how did this happen so fast in such a short period of time? And I think there are two very important answers to that. One is that, as it turns out, democracy depends on norms more than law in many cases. And these norms are very easy to actually bulldoze, right? For example, a big norm in the United States has been that if you are a government lawyer or a public prosecutor, you're independent of the executive power, right? You make decisions about bringing legal cases, and you make decisions about the validity of law based on an independent analysis of what the law says. Turns out there's nothing really to force any lawyers to actually do that, and so it can be eradicated very easily. So that's one point. The other point is that I think we have to understand the current moment, and this will be the last thing I say, in the United States as a moment in which massive long-term research and preparation has met with transformative political opportunity, right? This is a long-term project where the far right has studied very carefully and planned for exactly this moment. We didn't have to be in this moment. The stars have aligned. Congress and the White House and the courts are controlled by the same party, and that party has been taken over by far-right elements. And now there's a transformative change, and it turns out with all the planning, it can happen very fast.
Carolina, Paula, would you like to add something?
Okay, my colleagues already said the most important things about democracy and institutions, but I really liked your question, and in the case that I describe, it's very easy. And because you saw protests, so it's a sign of working democracy. So the decision that was made by Constitutional Court was actually anti-democratic. Looking at all these surveys, it was no social support for limitation of abortion. And actually the effect of this judgment is that, I will talk about it maybe later, that and civil society started to debate about it. And right now, society would like to have more liberal abortion laws than it was before. So it's pretty simple case. So you don't have to be, you don't have to say that it's against democracy. And I agree with Sarah that should we vote on human rights? If we start to vote on human rights, universal basic rights, I mean, we can end up in a very bad place, authoritarian. Yeah, and someone asked why it was that easy to hijack all these institutions and why populists were in power. So something was wrong with the liberal democracy. And now if you have a country, I don't know if we have these cases, that still it's democratic, liberal Democrats are in power, maybe it's still a moment to criticize them, to do a civil disobedience, to protest if something is wrong. Because if you will not do it, you will end up like in the US or in Poland or right now in the Netherlands. So I think maybe we should, as academics and as civil society, we should start to act earlier to prevent these autocratic populist changes. So just quick reflection.
Hola.
Because so I do think that obviously there is a broader issue of some crisis of liberal democracy, and like I think politically kind of to get over this, I think like some that would be up for political parties to propose like proper alternatives in terms of how do we view prosperity of people, how do we like address inequalities in our society. I think like to be very prudent, I think we are here mostly discussing a bit like what lawyers can do, kind of, which is like a very small part of this whole thing. And there I think it's really kind of, that's why this focus on the checks and balances, on kind of, on closing certain loopholes, because I think for lawyers it's always kind of, how to say, it is easier to set up a system a bit in advance and have some more like abstract and general laws, as we generally think, than to kind of act when shit hits the fan, kind of. And like I think like this is where kind of Sarah is mentioning about the political party regulations, that now it's possible that the PVV hardly has members, yeah? Like I think that's also part of the problem. I'm thinking like about this kind of, because with these issues of militant democracy, there is this case now in Romania where there was two presidential candidates were sort of barred by the Constitutional Court. One presidential candidate was barred already during the presidential campaign from running because she was saying racist things, especially against the Roma population. And this candidate is a member of the European Parliament, and she says the same things in the European Parliament. But she was considered kind of, you know, not eligible to run, even, or against kind of constitutional values to the extent that she was barred. And then another candidate who suddenly emerged in the elections with a lot of TikTok campaigns sponsored by Russian sources was barred kind of also because of this spreading disinformation issues, and like his election was cancelled. And I do cringe when I kind of hear that, because I think that that also is very difficult for a constitutional court to react without kind of there being any legislative regulating of disinformation in elections, kind of, in our democracies. Yeah?
We still have time for a few more questions. Please raise your hand.
So you mentioned the anti-democratic legal mobilization by populist groups, but I wonder what you think about the impact and the role of corporate actors in all of this. So in the EU, for instance, but also at national level, we're seeing a huge deregulation push at the cost of social and environmental standards, with the recent omnibus package, for instance. But it has actually been a consequence of corporate instrumentalization of the law, of lobbying and litigation that has spanned back decades. And they're using a certain narrative and discourse that is actually shaping this idea of regulation and innovation, or this space in between, and public and private power, that is quite similar to the discourse that is used by right-wing powers. So yeah, I wonder how you see this playing out, the tension between the market and what we're seeing in these populist groups.
This is more closely related to the filling up the gaps as well, especially in the European Union, because you already said something about the gaps in the Netherlands, but it was more, I'm also very curious to maybe you, Mr. Cummings, about your experience at the US level. Which bodies in the European Union do you think certain gaps should be filled up to maybe prevent future influences of right-wing populist members of parliament, or maybe in court, taking over control?
So throughout this whole panel, I felt like we were really talking about right-wing populists. And I've been wondering, why are left-wing populists so much worse at organizing? Why is it right-wing populists specifically that are doing all these things? And in connection to that, why are more centrist parties, which are supposed to sort of more represent the average voter, also so terrible at actually doing that, that these populist right-wing parties are able to captivate people?
I was wondering if you think there's a role for legal systems and constitution to also look at civil polarization. So if we're each locking each other out, and we're doing that by flip-flopping, that of course can easily lead to polarization. So I wonder if legal systems should have an element of compromise, where like we have in a little bit in Dutch politics, for example. Mulder.
Final chance to ask a question. All right, who would like to start? Scott?
Okay. I mean, these are really great questions. I'll just say it's such a thank you all for being here and for the deep engagement on these really important issues. Let me just say, so polarization is a critical driver of the situation we're in. And, you know, there are mechanisms to reduce polarization. So polarization in the United States has been driven by a lot of different forces, but a primary one has been gerrymandering the political districts. And, you know, that's something that actually could be changed in ways that would actually promote more centrist-based political engagement, because people would have to appeal across the political aisle in order to get elected. And unfortunately, for reasons that I think in the short term seem strategic on the part of both parties, honestly, but I think it's not completely symmetrical. It's been more driven by the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. But for reasons that seem to be mostly motivated by short-term gain, there's been this movement to do that in ways that then have created these completely polarized districts that then motivate very far right candidates to run, and has empowered far right politicians like Trump that have a political platform and a media platform to be able to actually target districts where non-far right Republicans run and basically disqualify them, and so then it sort of feeds upon itself in that particular way. So I mean, so that one answer is that there are actually solutions to this particular problem that are political solutions that can be implemented by law. But now it's a question of, someone I think said this before, like once this erosion starts to happen and these extreme parties take power, they have no incentive to actually go back to the previous status quo. On this question of left versus right, I mean, it is an interesting question. The left has been successful. I mean, you think about Castro in Cuba, you think about Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. There are examples. I mean, this is a controversial example, but you know, the recent judicial reforms in Mexico that essentially allowed for the new kind of center-left party to eventually capture the Constitutional Court, was deemed by some as an autocratic legal move. Like, this is coming out of the left. So it does happen across the aisles in the U.S. and in Europe for reasons that have historical origins. It's a far right project, right? It is a far right project. So the left can use it, and maybe there are underlying ideological differences that really explain this shift. But it has been, at least on the continent and in the U.S., primarily a right wing project. I think the last thing I just wanted to mention on this question of kind of the sort of liberal democracy and its future is that I think we also have to factor into the conversation disinformation, and this maybe goes a little bit to the point about corporate actors and their incentives. I think it's a little bit of a different point, but I think we have to distinguish between the actual failures of liberal democracy and the manufactured failures of liberal democracy that have been fed to people to motivate them to vote for this thing which is against their interest, right? And that is a real, and maybe, you know, again, one of the most fundamental problems to think about doing. When Elon Musk bought what's now X, I scratched my head. Why in the world would he do this crazy business idea? But he knew what he was doing, right? And this is this is the culmination of it.
Yeah. To follow up on the left and right wing populism and centrism. So I think we should never forget that one of the biggest cases of democratic erosion we've seen in the past decades is actually one of left-wing populism, which you already referred to, which is the case of Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro. It's now a fully authoritarian regime in which the opposition, irrespective of how broad its electoral support, cannot regain power. And for a long time, left-wing populism was the dominant threat to liberal democracy, especially in Latin America. What has changed in large parts of the world is that in terms of social concerns, cultural issues broadly understood, whether that's about immigration, law and order, even climate change is experienced by citizens as a cultural issue, have become more dominant in society than socioeconomic concerns. Now, this is not a purely bottom-up phenomenon driven by social changes. It's largely an engineered phenomenon in terms that the importance that citizens attribute to all kinds of social problems is heavily influenced by political parties, both of the far right itself, who have an ideological incentive to put these issues front and center, but also by mainstream parties who increasingly compete on these issues because they think they need to win back voters from the far right, as well as by both mainstream media and social media. So we know from a lot of research that there's disproportionate attention to these kinds of social problems in the media. And I think one of the things that we should remember when we try to grapple with this fundamental change is that across many countries, it's not the case that citizens have become more critical about immigration and identity and other issues. Their positions are relatively stable. What has changed is they rank these problems much higher in terms of their concerns compared to the labor market, the housing market, or other kinds of issues, which they also largely interpret through a cultural lens. So if they think about shortages on the housing market, they actually think about asylum seekers being entitled to social housing or about expats taking up housing on the buyer's market, rather than liberalization of the housing market or sort of socioeconomic causes of these problems.
So maybe we need more liberal populism.
I don't think it can exist. And this is also, it's an important debate because you often also see social democrats saying, we need to become more populist.
Like Chantal Mouffe.
Yeah, Chantal Mouffe says that, but also active politicians said that, right? In the UK for a time, that was a popular narrative. In here, the Netherlands, it's been very pervasive in the Labour Party. But what a lot of politicians then mean, we need to reconnect with, citizens, which is a fundamental task of political parties anyways. They don't mean that they should pit ordinary people and understand them as sort of homogenous in terms of their political preferences against elites and moralize that distinction. That is inherently challenging for liberal democracy if you do that.
Paula or Kalina?
I will maybe just very briefly speak on the corporations, and then maybe you have more general comments, because I think, in this strategic litigation, we've seen companies often being a very kind of good sort of applicant for this strategic litigation cases, but both from the right and from the left wing. So I again would say per se that we don't it's not exclusive, because we've seen these cases, especially in the US, for instance, with, the bakery not wanting to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding, or especially, these cases about political donations of companies to parties as their freedom of speech of companies. But also with regard to the rule of law crisis or democratic backsliding in Poland. We've had cases brought both to Strasbourg and Luxembourg courts that were extra litigated in the name of companies to also show that the lack of judicial independence, lack of due process was something that was kind of hurting also the economic actors in the society, and they were even kind of a bit engineered in order to make that point. I don't know, it can be, I'm not saying that it's easy, because we've tried to actually find some companies that would want to sue because of the internal border controls within Schengen that Germany has now especially. And if anyone knows any companies that are kind of suffering because of delays on the German-Dutch border and are willing to spend a few years going to court, I'm still looking for those. But like, because these border controls are clearly illegal under EU law, but indeed, like, it's all often, I think also, yeah, us as academics, or even we have more maybe connections to civil society than to the corporate world. That's maybe also something that is telling. But yeah, maybe Carolina, you have more general.
No, I have comment regarding the social media. I think it's crucial right now when we talk about populism, right wing, right left. Yesterday I talked with Jeff, and Jeff told me that Andrew Tate, it's a conservative far-right influencer, let's say. It's really popular among young boys, not only in the Netherlands, but in every country. So I think what we can do right now, if we can change law, maybe we should regulate somehow social media. As Scott said, you didn't know why Elon Musk bought X, now you know. So influencing people by social media, I think influence at the same time deepening polarization. It's easy to target younger people and actually because later they will vote, and it's much easier to spread far-right or far-left ideas to these clear minds than talk about liberal democracy than courts. So, but I don't have clear answers what we can do and how we can regulate it. But my idea is maybe we should do something and regulate social media, and especially among young people, because they are like sponges, and they are looking for some influences. And right now they are. I think someone asked about why left-wing populism is not it's not in power. It's not that strong. So I think maybe right-wing influencers are better in social media, and they already know how to influence young people.
Sarah, you wanted?
Yeah, I want to pick up on this point of regulating social media, and also perhaps send you home with a hopeful message. So, of course, there is a very large regulatory framework now for social media in the EU in the form of the DSA. And there's plenty of regulations in there that are very helpful. The problem is the guts to enforce them, which are absent. And I think in that respect, I think it's interesting to look at Brazil, which after Bolsonaro has really made a turnaround. First of all, in prosecuting everyone who was involved in the coup after the elections, but also in taking its own legislation with respect to social media seriously and taking on acts relatively successfully. So I think, if we leave here with some hope today, it's that a country like Brazil has really managed to overcome this populist moment in its history and is really on the right track now to being a strong liberal democracy again. So all's not lost.
And with this hopeful message, we have to close today's meeting. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And thank you very much that you decided to spend the Friday evening with us. We really appreciate it. I would also like to thank the Pack House and the all wonderful team here that made this meeting possible. Please check out the website of Pack House, because in the next 2 months there are a lot of interesting events, as you can see on the screen. In March there will be a discussion on Palestine and Israel conflict. Then there is discussion on the role of judges in solving conflicts, and then there's the discussion in April with Gert Maak on the parallels between the 30s and our current time. Unfortunately, those events are in Dutch, but you can practice your Dutch by joining. So again, thank you very much. Have a lovely evening and see you at the next event.
Join us for a beer.